There have been a lot of changes around college football just in the last week, even in the last 24 hours. So let's consider today our official therapy venting session surrounding the changes of college football. And let's address the most important question around here. How does that impact LSU football?
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Plus, don't forget, you can also find us on YouTube as well. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I'm your host, as I am every day. You can follow me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. You can also subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. Just search Locked on LSU in that search bar. Hit that subscribe button, and you won't miss a single second of your Locked On LSU content. Also, today's edition of Locked On LSU is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/locked on college. Terms and conditions apply. Well, let's get into it because it has been a weird couple of weeks in college football. I could even go back as far as to say this has been a weird year for college football, maybe a weird couple of years for college football. It goes back to 2021 when the transfer rule changed, where you could transfer once without having to sit out. That's what caused, a huge change and shift and rapid change with the transfer portal. And then in 2021 as well, it was also announced that Texas and Oklahoma, it was leaked really, not necessarily formally announced. It was leaked that Texas and Oklahoma would join the SEC in 2025. As we know now, it will be in 2024. And then NIL became a thing, became legal. Paying players for their name, image, and likeness became legal in 2022, this past summer. It was announced that USC and UCLA would leave the Pac 12 and join the Big Ten. All of these over the last few years have been incredibly rapid and massive changes in college football. And ever since those changes were made, really ever since USC and UCLA decided to join the Big 12, I think we knew that what has gone on over the last week to 2 weeks, that all of these changes were imminent. Maybe we hoped that they wouldn't change. Maybe we hoped that they wouldn't happen. And maybe a lot of us were just wondering when it was going to happen. If not sooner, then later. But I think we all knew. We felt a seismic shift in the future of college football when USC and UCLA joined the Big Ten. So now here we are. Because this past week, we had a Power 5 conference essentially die. USC, UCLA leave the Pac 12. Colorado also leaves the Pac 12, which was a hit because I think it was maybe the biggest sign ever of the discomfort or the disarray that the Pac 12 found itself in. But the Pac 12 could have existed, it could have lived without Colorado. And that's no knock against Colorado, it's just the reality of the situation. I didn't even know if the Pac 12 was going to be able to survive without USC and UCLA. But even without Colorado, I saw a path. I saw a possibility for the Pac 12 to maintain its relevancy. But once Oregon and Washington made the decision to leave the Pac 12 for the Big Ten following USC and UCLA, there you go. Stick a fork in the Pac 12 because it was done. We all kind of questioned, no, I at least did, I'm sure you did too, questioned how the Pac 12 was going to be able to survive without its two biggest brands in the biggest market, in USC and UCLA. But as we saw with the Big 12 losing its two biggest brands and its two biggest markets in Texas and Oklahoma, it still found a way to be relevant. It still found a way to negotiate a media rights deal that was satisfactory for all of the member schools. The Pac 12 wasn't able to do that. So if we thought that it could exist without USC and UCLA, well, you lose Oregon and Washington, and there goes any possibility of the Pac 12 being able to survive on its own. Oregon and Washington leave, Arizona State, and Utah all head to the Big 12, leaving Cal, Stanford, Oregon State, and Washington State to fend for themselves. What was going to happen to them? Which now brings us to the latest chapter of this seemingly never-ending book of conference realignment. The latest news, I believe this was first reported by Pete Thamel, is that the ACC is now having discussions of potentially adding Stanford and Cal. Now, Pete Thamel reported this and cautioned everyone, hey, it's early days, very early discussions. We're just in the preliminary stages of all of this. But I think that we're all smart enough and we've seen this enough to know that that's not necessarily the case. And just because it's early talks doesn't mean that it's not very close to happening, because that's what Pete Thamel also reported with Oregon and Washington, was that they were having very early discussions, very preliminary talks about Oregon and Washington potentially joining the Big Ten. And then there you had it, about 24 hours later, Oregon and Washington were voted into the Big Ten. So I don't care that it's early talks. I don't care that it's preliminary. Once these things start to come to surface, they're happening. So let's operate under the umbrella that Cal and Stanford headed to the SEC, because let's be real, it's probably happening sooner rather than it's happening later. And I think it's positive for both parties involved. It's good for Cal and Stanford because they will have a power, I guess now Power 4 conference bid. They'll have the cushion and the comfort of having a media rights deal. Now, maybe the ACC's media rights deal isn't the best one to get into at the moment, just considering that it's significantly less than what the Big Ten and the SEC are getting, and they're on the hook through 2036. But still, it's better than what they got now, which is a whole lot of nothing. So it would provide Cal and Stanford some stability. What it would give the ACC is expansion of the ACC network, and it would allow ESPN to get back what they lost when the Pac-12 was killed by the Big Ten and the Big 12, and that is a West Coast late night time slot, and that's West Coast brands, entities, and television markets. So I think it's positive for all parties involved. But overall, this is a whole lot of change. And I think that at the same time, I'm mourning the college football that I used to know, while also embracing the newness of what college football has to offer. Because I'm sad to see kind of the sanctity and the purity of college football become stained by the greed of the powers that be. For that purity and sanctity to be completely uprooted and ruined by money. But that's the world and the era of college football that we now live in. The bottom line is the dollar. And the powers that be, from their perspective, rivalries be damned, geography be damned. None of that matters anymore. What's going to give us the best path to making the most money possible? I don't like that that's how college football is going, but also there's nothing that we can do about it. I think that we're now going to be in a college football that's more competitive, that's more exciting, better matchups. I don't know about you, but I'm more excited about watching Oregon play Ohio State or Wisconsin than Oregon playing Cal or, Washington State. And that's no disrespect to those two programs, but they don't pack the same kind of juice that maybe some other Big Ten programs have. And look, your Power 5, powerful brand versus kind of dinky brand games, those are still going to exist. You're still going to have a USC Rutgers. But for every USC Rutgers that you have a USC Penn State. You've got a UCLA, Michigan. And I think that's exciting. Although I don't like the changes because I'm just somebody who doesn't like change, I love the tradition of college football. These changes are inevitable. These changes were imminent, and I think we've known it. We've known it ever since USC and UCLA decided to jump ship from the Pac-12 and join the Big Ten. So it it's saddening to see this. It's overwhelming to see so much change. It's totally fair and totally justified to be nervous or anxious about what the future of college football holds. But I think one important thing for me that has remained is even over these past couple of years of wild and crazy and rampant and quick changes. When I sit down on a Saturday in the fall to watch whatever big game it is of the week, none of that changes. The product, the on the field product, hasn't changed. In fact, I think it's only gotten better. So while that may seem kind of like a not important right now because it's August 8th and we don't have football, once we get to September, once we get to October, once we get to rivalry week, the things that we're talking about now might seem minute and not important because we have football and we still have a college football that we all know and love. I think that's the important thing to remember here. So that's my therapy venting session about the changes of conference realignment that we've been experiencing so far over the last couple of weeks in college football. But coming up next, let's address the most important question. How does this all affect our team? How does this all affect LSU? We'll get into that coming up next. First, I want to tell you about LinkedIn Jobs. One of the greatest things about LinkedIn Jobs is that it provides you and your small business a sense of security. Because these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business. And you want to be 100% certain that you've got access to the best qualified candidates available, which is why you've got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. So the radio station that I worked for, we used LinkedIn Jobs to fill an open job that we had available because we had an opening for a very important position about a month or so ago. And that was right at the beginning of training camp, getting into football season. We needed something or someone to help us fill that job quickly. So that's why we went to LinkedIn Jobs. It was a wonderful resource for us. Plus, it was super, super easy to navigate. All you have to do is go to linkedin.com and then create a free job post on LinkedIn Jobs and then add a purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you are hiring. Also, there are really simple and special screening tools that LinkedIn Jobs uses, which helped us so much when we were looking to hire somebody. They use screening questions, which made it super easy for us to focus on the candidates with just the right skills and experience so we could quickly prioritize who we wanted to interview and who we wanted to hire. We were, along with I'm sure you are, with you and your small business, whenever you're hiring, you have very specific parameters that you're looking for, maybe specific expertise or experience or education. Well, LinkedIn will filter through those candidates and do all the hard work for you because it is so important to add the right team member for your small business. They'll have a huge and positive impact for the rest of your team and for your business as a whole. So it's why small businesses ranked LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Well, thanks again for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. It's been a wild, wild past couple of days, weeks, months, years, even in college football. So many changes, potentially Cal and Stanford going to the ACC, Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA headed to the Big Ten, Arizona, Colorado, Arizona State, Utah, they're all headed to the Big 12. Like what the heck is going on in college football, people? Like it is going to be almost irrecognizable in the next coming years. But the most important thing is, how does that affect us? How does that affect our Tigers? How does all of these changes in college football affect LSU? And I will tell you this is something that's always a question that's in the back of my mind is whenever there's big college football changes or big college football rule changes or whatever it might be. The number one question that comes to my mind is, okay, but how does that affect LSU? That's been in my mind throughout all of these changes. But I think what I've realized is the more that things change, the more that there is conference realignment, the more that there is NIL thrown in there, the more I realize how safe LSU is from all of these changes. Because I don't think that there is a single version of the future that doesn't involve LSU as a foundational piece of it. There's one, whenever USC and UCLA joined the Big Ten, the big idea was, okay, well, there's ultimately going to be two super conferences. It's kind of looking like college football might head that way because now we're at a Power Four. Might just continue to shrink and shrink and shrink. There's not going to be two super conferences that don't involve LSU. There's not going to be an SEC that doesn't involve LSU. There's not going to be an LSU without a very robust and beneficial media rights deal. There's not going to be a college football world in which LSU is not an integral part of it. Let's just look at all the changes. 12-team playoff. I think that only helps LSU. 4 teams exclusive. And honestly, I'm going to be honest with all of y'all. I don't like 12-team playoffs. I think that's too many teams. I think the college football playoff should mean something. I think that it should be an exclusive fraternity of teams that are invited to the college football playoff every year. 12 teams dilutes that a little bit, but it only helps LSU because it only opens the field even more for teams that play incredibly difficult and competitive schedules like LSU does to get an invitation into the college football playoff. So 12-team playoffs, it really only helps LSU. Conference realignment, it's only making the media rights deal payout for LSU even better. And you look at the SEC as a whole, really. Conference realignment has unintended consequences. And I think those have been more relevant now that we've seen the Pac-12 kind of disassemble. So one of the unintended consequences of that is travel. Like, good luck trying to navigate tennis, swimming, cross country, the non-revenue sports. Good luck trying to negotiate and navigate travel from LA to Rutgers. Good luck trying to negotiate travel from Oregon to Iowa. The football team will be able to figure it out. It's the non-revenue sports that I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult and a whole lot more expensive. Well, that's not something that affects LSU because as far as the SEC has added teams and has realigned the conference, it's really not that crazy geographically. Like, no, Columbia, Missouri is not the closest place in the world. No, Austin, Texas, or Norman, Oklahoma aren't the closest places in the world. But it's not like you're dealing with cross-country travel. All you're doing is just extending the footprint a little bit. And the geographical footprint of the SEC makes more sense than any other conference in the now Power Four. So those unintended consequences, so to speak, don't really affect LSU. The lost rivalries, we can have a conversation about that because, whenever the SEC decides to plan the schedule further than 2024, when we're looking at 2025 and beyond, can we revisit the idea of a 9-game conference schedule? That's really up to ESPN and the money that they're willing to put forth for an extra conference game. So if ESPN isn't willing to put that money forth for a 9th conference game, or if the powers that be in the SEC want to stick with an 8-game schedule, well, then that would be an unintended consequence that LSU may not and probably will not play Alabama every year or Ole Miss every year. And I don't like that. But they're at least still in the same conference. Like Oregon State, you can kiss that goodbye. Washington State, you can kiss that goodbye. Now, those are rivalries that you're just not going to get not on a yearly basis, an annual basis. That's rivalries that you might not ever get again. unless they strategically plan that in the schedule or unless they meet in bowl games. So, really, for the most part, this doesn't affect LSU in a negative way, really, at all. I was talking about this. Tim Hasselbeck, he's an ESPN NFL analyst. He also calls games for the ACC on ESPN. He was on my radio show today, and I was asking him about this. And he said, look, Caroline, like, you went to LSU. You can sleep at night. You're going to be fine. He's saying that as a Boston College alumni, the future of Boston College, I very clearly and visibly see a super conference that doesn't involve Boston College. So I was like, look, you know what? You're right about that there's not going to be a college football world in which LSU isn't just involved, in which LSU isn't heavily involved, in which LSU doesn't get one of the first invitations. So, yes, the college football fan in me, who loves the purity of the sport, mourns the sport and doesn't like these changes. But the LSU fan in me looks at this and thinks, hey, this is kind of best case scenario. If, with all of the changes in mind. Coming up next, though, an update from Brian Kelly on Jimmy Lindsay, defensive line coach. We'll get into that coming up next. Well, thanks again for making Locked on LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. All right, so LSU back out on the practice field today. Coming up on tomorrow's episode, I'm going to have a full breakdown of what Brian Kelly said at the podium, what we saw at practice. I just wanted to get these conference realignments thoughts out, but I will have a practice recap for all of y'all on tomorrow's edition of Locked on LSU. But Brian Kelly did provide a bit of an update on defensive line coach Jimmy Lindsay. So at the beginning of training camp and Brian Kelly's fall camp introductory press conference, he mentioned that Jimmy Lindsay was going to take a step away from the team to deal with personal health matters. He provided an update today, said that Jimmy Lindsay is expected to be released from the hospital very soon. Brian Kelly also mentions that he's got a long road to recovery ahead of him, but Brian Kelly also mentioned that, hey, it's really good and really positive that we can at least talk about the light at the end of the tunnel of Jimmy Lindsay potentially being released from the hospital very soon. Now, in the meantime, John Jancic, outside linebackers coach and special teams coordinator, has been serving as the defensive line coach and will continue to do so until Jimmy Lindsay is able to come back and be fully healthy and be able to be 100% again. But I think the important thing to remember here is sometimes in life, football is not the most important thing. And this is one of those instances where football is going to take a backseat to health and to recovery. It takes a backseat to Jimmy Lindsay and to his family and making sure that they have what they need, that they have the proper time to recover themselves and to rehab themselves. So unsure of what Jimmy Lindsay is dealing with. I'm going to afford him and his family that privacy to deal what they need to do in privacy and with their own family matters. But of course, I wish him nothing but the best. I know you do too. Wish him nothing but the best, a speedy recovery, and hoping that everything is okay. Physically, mentally, emotionally, all of the above, and hoping that we can see Jimmy Lindsay out there soon enough. But positive news, at least, coming out from Brian Kelly and the status of Jimmy Lindsay. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every single day. Like I mentioned, coming up on tomorrow's podcast, we'll have a full breakdown of practice on Tuesday and what Brian Kelly had to say to the media on Tuesday. All of that coming up in tomorrow's edition of Locked on LSU.